There we go. Welcome everybody. My name is David Kramer. I am the director of the library here at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you early September still, right? I mean, early on in the academic year, this is the first of our book talks sponsored by the library for this year, and it is a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Daniel Nevins, a privilege too. It's a fine way for us to begin. Before getting into the substance, let me just let everybody know how we're going to proceed. First of all, I ask everybody to stay on mute. If you stray off of mute, I will find you and I will mute you. So you don't have to worry about hitting the wrong thing at the wrong time. I promise I'll follow up. Our format will be introductions followed by presentation and comments by the author, and then thereafter we will I'll express some questions to Danny, and then we'll open up to all of you. So at that point, you'll be welcome to raise your hand. In the course of the discussion, you are welcome to put your questions in chat, and I will collect them and direct them to the author as we go. This is an hour-long program where we're strict about our hour, so you can expect that we'll be coming to conclusion at a little bit less than an hour from now. That gives you an idea of what to expect. So now, to begin more formally, as I said, it is our pleasure to welcome Rabbi Danny Nevins and all of you to this first book talk of the year. A fascinating book that will lead us to all kinds of questions, which is always the best way to proceed. It sounds, Danny, from the conversations you were having with some individuals before we just began, that you know a lot of people who are here on screen somewhere in the background. So there are a lot of personal connections, and that's great. But for those of you who don't know, Danny, who is now the head of school at the Golda Ach Academy. Is that the correct pronunciation? Did I get that right?
Yeah, called the Ak.
Okay, Ach. Okay, good. It's actually down the street from where I grew up. So,
Yeah.
I mean, once upon a time it was Solomon Schechter. That was after my time, but I remember it well. But certainly in my neighborhood. And before that, as many of you know, Danny was the dean of the rabbinical school and the professional school. So both rabbis and cantors here at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he served with great love and appreciation on the part of his students and colleagues, and was a very, very important part of our community for a long time. He has been involved in questions of the contemporary world in halakhah through the law committee of the Rabbinical Assembly for many, many years. And that, of course, is what is central to the book that he will now be discussing. Have I left anything crucial out, Danny?
We're all good.
Okay, good. So I'm going to remove myself from the spotlight and let you hog the screen, at least for the time being, and then we'll get back together after that.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Dr. David Kramer. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm honored by JTS and the JTS Library hosting this event and inviting me to speak. And it's, again, lovely to see so many people from different parts of my life, and then many other people who I don't know, but who I share, presumably, a passion for the love of Judaism and learning together with you. So the book, as you know, is called Torah and Technology, Circuits, Cells, and the Sacred Path. Actually, the cover, this is put out by a newish publisher called Izun Books. The cover was designed using AI, that DALI program, and organized by the owner of the publishing house, or the president of it, Adam Zagoria Moffat, a former student of mine from JTS. And the book, as you heard from David, is largely based on responsa that I wrote for the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, the CJLS. The CJLS is a body of rabbis. It goes back more than a century now, to like around 1917, I believe. And in its current configuration, which it's been for about 50 years, it has 25 rabbis who are voting members of the committee. It also has 5 lay members and 1 cantor who are also there to inform the conversation, participate in deliberations, and at times even co-author papers. I was a secretary for the law committee when I was a student at JTS for 2 years, from 92 to 94. And then after my ordination in 94, I started my career in Michigan, where I see several friends there. And about 5 years into my work in Michigan, I was invited to join the law committee as a voting member now. And so that was in 99. So it's been 25 years since I joined the law committee. And I want to go back a little bit further in my own bio to give you a sense of how I came to be interested in these particular topics. When I was an undergraduate in college, I was a history major, but I was really interested also in bioethics on the side. My father is a physician, retired physician now, and he had practiced internal medicine and cardiology for decades in New Jersey. And he was very involved in some of the landmark bioethics cases, especially end-of-life healthcare in New Jersey. And so I knew that he was an avid reader of a journal called the Hastings Center Review. And the Hastings Center is up in Westchester, and it's an interdisciplinary bioethics research center. And so I reached out to them and received an invitation to be an intern for a summer. I think it was the summer of '86. And so I went to Hastings, and I loved it because you had people who were philosophers and lawyers and physicians and bench scientists and also theologians. And everyone was working on their own project, but at lunchtime they would come together and somebody would read a paper, and then you'd get this fascinating conversation from all those different disciplines. My paper was about end-of-life medical treatment, withholding and withdrawing life support from people who are terminally ill. And I did a comparative religious perspective, interviewing Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish scholars and reading their work, eventually writing an essay that was published in my student journal in college. But one of the people I interviewed was named Seymour Siegel. Dr. Rabbi Seymour Siegel was a professor at JTS, and I didn't know it, but he was near the end of his life. And he had been the chair of the CJLS. And as chair, he had steered the discourse towards science and religion, about what are the connections between ethical discourse and technological discourse. And he got involved on the national level with conversations at the White House and so on to try to bring together people who represented the values of society, as he put it, with the scientists who were making these rapid changes, some of them quite concerning, let's say, from an ethical perspective. And he wrote some early essays, one in the journal you may remember called Shema, that said Judaism supports a natural death. And so I interviewed Seymour Siegel, and then he asked me if, once I finished at Hastings, if I'd be his secretary. So I worked with him for the rest of that summer, taking him to doctor's appointments and doing his correspondence. And I think that was really the germ of an idea that after college, I might come to JTS and go to rabbinical school. I was thinking of other pathways of law or history, but I decided to become a rabbi largely because I knew I could continue to do research and reading and writing and teaching, but to do it within the context of a pastoral role where I would be working with real people on their real life issues. And so it wouldn't just be sort of detached scholarship, but actually applied. So that was more or less what the plan was, and it's more or less what happened. As a young member of the law committee, I started where I thought I would in bioethics. I wrote an early tshuva that had to do with brain death. I called it Contemporary Criteria for the Declaration of Death, and I was looking that had been proposed since 1968 or so to declare a patient to have died, even if they still had heartbeat. And the motivation was to be able to remove vital organs like the heart or the liver or kidneys to transplant to other patients and save their lives now that there were anti-rejection medications. And so that was one of my first projects. I was skeptical that Judaism could support that. I knew that it was controversial, but over the course of time, I came up with an approach which I still support. So that was my first major paper for the law committee in 2004, so about 20 years ago. And then from discussions of bioethics, I started being interested in issues of disability, specifically with people who are blind, and can they participate ritually more fully than had been the case before. I had a congregant at my synagogue in Michigan at Adat Shalom, Dr. Abe Nemeth, who was a blind mathematician, and he had actually developed the Braille mathematical notation system. And I worked with him a little bit on understanding his connection to ritual. He loved to read Haftarah for the congregation from a Braille Tanakh that he had helped to edit with his grandfather back in the 1930s. And so I wrote about blind Jews. I then moved on to issues of sexuality. The law committee was debating issues having to do with gay rights, basically. And I came up with an approach that was very much focused on human dignity, a moral value that I felt needed to be part of the conversation of sexuality, that it wasn't just a matter of precedent. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So I eventually wound up merging efforts with two other rabbis, Elliot Dorff and Avram Reisner, and our paper was passed in 2006, and it was kind of the foundation for JTS and other rabbinical schools beginning to admit openly gay and lesbian students, and then eventually trans and binary, bisexual, and other sexual identities. And a few years later, we returned to that topic and created same-sex wedding and divorce rituals. But increasingly, my interest was on things having to do with technology. And in 2012, I wrote a large paper, and it really is rather long, on electricity and Shabbat. The reason it's long is because the laws of Shabbat are complicated. And I also approached it not just as what was the bottom line, but how do you get there? And I realized that very few people in our circles actually know the laws of Shabbat or understand both the formal elements and the more sort of spiritual elements and how they play together. And so that was a paper in 2012 that was actually motivated by a question, an actual question from a synagogue that was considering installing a wheelchair lift that would be electrically controlled. And they wanted to know, well, are you allowed to have an electrical wheelchair lift on Shabbat? And I said, well, you know, that led me down the whole rabbit hole. Well, what are the actual objections? We have to get clear about that. And then what are some of the accommodations that could be made for the sake of human dignity, the same really moral value that had inspired our approach on the gay rights paper. Having done that, I started to go on a bit of a tear when it came to technology. I was very interested, having done the redefinition of death, to talk about the redefinition of life, and specifically issues having to do with genetic engineering. And at that time, there was the beginning of conversation about CRISPR, which was a new type of gene editing system. And I wrote my tshuva that in 2015, CRISPR was first sort of identified in 2011, but it was only really becoming known around then. And I made arguments for why modifying the genes of different plants and animals to integrate even transgenic, that is, materials from another animal or another organism, might be permitted and wouldn't be necessarily forbidden under the rubric of kilaim, of the prohibition of blending species, which we read about actually this week in Parshat Ki Tetzei. And at the time, I got invited to a conference with this scholar, Jennifer Doudna. She was one of the two creators of this new system, and she won the Nobel Prize a few years later for it. And she had a convening at her lab out in Berkeley of scientists, lawyers, philosophers, and religious leaders to talk about the ethics of genetic engineering, especially of humans. And I remember at the time, a professor from Harvard said to me, with all due respect, Rabbi, why should I care what a rabbi thinks about, CRISPR and genetic engineering? And, I was a little taken aback, but I couldn't hide from her. We were actually in the backseat of a cab together. And I said, well, a couple of things. One is I'm a custodian of a 3,000-year-old tradition, and there's a lot of wisdom in that tradition. And certainly it shouldn't only be Jews who are talking about it, but I think that other religions should also be part of this conversation because we might have ideas that would be useful in this new paradigm. Another thing is that I represent a living community, and to the extent that scientists are rushing ahead with redefining life and death and changing the nature of our very bodies, there's going to be some reactions that are negative. And if you don't get into conversation with communities, including religious communities now, then you won't know what the concerns are and you won't be prepared for the reaction. So much better to include us at the table. And that's been my approach to all these topics. I also added lab-grown meat and others. And my thinking is not, I'm not writing, and people might say, well, who's your audience? I'm not writing just for people who are committed Jews, who are looking to know, am I allowed to do this or am I not allowed to do that? To be honest, there are relatively few people who are coming up to me and asking me, am I allowed to eat lab meat or something like that? It's more to be part of bringing the world of Judaism, which sometimes can feel like a narrow and small world, into conversation with a much larger society so that we can have impact, we can be relevant, and we can see the relevance of our own wisdom for the larger world. And so my hope is that this book would actually have an impact not only for Jews, but even for readers of other religions or no religion who are interested in the intersection of ethics and technology. This book has an introduction. It has 8 chapters, which are responsa. 3 of them have to do with the epidemic, the pandemic, and some of the technical things. Could you use Zoom for worship, for instance? Another had to do with triage ethics. Who should get scarce medical resources first? And that took me into an important question about, does Judaism ever allow us to stray from rule-based ethics into a more outcome-based or utilitarian type of ethics? So that's something we can talk about more later as well. The last thing I want to say as a matter of introduction is that when people ask, what is halakhah? The most common translation is Jewish law, right? But I am frustrated with that translation because law typically has to do with order. It has to do with the minimum sort of constraints on individual volition that would allow us to have an ordered society where people don't hurt one another. But of course, halakhah is about much more than that. It's about kedoshim to you, about becoming sacred. It's about tzedek tirdof, pursuing righteousness. It's about v'asita hatov v'yashar. You should do that which is upright. It's about v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, about loving people, and about v'ahavta t'bnei loving God. It's about piety. It's about kindness. It's about our spiritual life. It's about far more than law would ever capture. Yes, Judaism talks about damages and who owes for damage done to another person. And yes, it uses the language of compulsion that is found in law systems. But for the most part, it's the exercise of piety, of walking with God. And for that reason, my approach to halakhah is always to look at the formal precedents that we have available in the codes and the responsa going back for millennia. But I also want to know, what are the values that are trying to be expressed? And in that way, I'm less a legal formalist than a purposive interpreter of Jewish law, asking what was the original goal of this system and how can we best express those goals? And so that has certainly came into play when we were talking about homosexuality and different constructions of gender and sexuality. But it also is the case when we're talking about lab-grown meat or genetic engineering, any of these things that we do to try to improve our lives without losing a sense of the sanctity of our lives. And that perhaps is enough for me to say as an introduction. So David, I know you have questions, and so I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. And I'm going to leave you central on the screen because it's your voice that is central to this conversation today. I want to begin. First of all, everybody, I invite you, as we're discussing, to contribute your own questions and put them in the chat. But Danny, you've used the term responsa. You have more typically right now just simply not translated the term, used the term tshuva, right? Meaning response, answer, or some such. but I imagine there are people who are on this call who actually don't know. I mean, they've heard the term perhaps, but they don't know what a tshuva is. So I'm wondering if you could illustrate, provide us an example from your book of one of the tshuvas you've written. What was the question? How did you go about exploring it? How did you offer the tshuva itself? And how does the process that you engage in relate to um, kind of traditional historical responsa, and in what ways might it be different?
Great, great. So the process of asking questions and seeking answers is something that you already find going all the way back to the Torah. You certainly have Abraham in conversation with God, is that the right thing to do? What should we do here? But Moses certainly gets asked these questions, like the daughters of Tzalafchad, to give one example, and them asking him, what do we do about our inheritance? And Moses checking with God, coming back with an answer, and then another group, the chieftains, coming and saying, well, you gave them that answer, but you didn't address our concern, and what about that? And so this interactive process of questions and answers is sort of a model for what emerges in rabbinic culture. In the Talmud itself, it's very common to have questions were asked, the questions were asked, and responses were given. And sometimes those responses are built on the foundation of, well, it's a tradition. I saw my teacher, my father, whatever said this, and that's what we're doing. Sometimes they say it's based on scripture, and they're going to quote what verse. And sometimes it's going to be based on logic, svara, and this is the obvious thing that you should be doing. But that back and forth is actually a sacred activity. This is the very nature of Torah study. In fact, the Talmud is famously reluctant to close down conversations. It sort of extends the conversations generation after generation. Later, the rabbis, especially in the medieval period, perhaps under some influence from the dislocations they'd had, maybe from Muslim culture, started to codify Jewish law and to try to say, well, what's the bottom line here? And so we start to have codes of Jewish law. But at the very same time that you have codes of Jewish law, you continue to have this sort of responsa discourse, which allows you to get into the more specific circumstances. So for instance, Maimonides writes one of the great codes of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah, but he also has these letters that are written to him asking about the particulars, the Jews of Yemen who are under pressure to convert to Islam or who had converted to Islam and wanted to return to Judaism. What do they do about their circumstance? And what happens was that over the course of time, more and more of these questions were sent to the great academies. And some of this was under the influence of the great Abbasid Empire, the Second Muslim Empire, which the Muslims who were based, in what's today Iraq and Baghdad, they set themselves up as the authorities for the whole Muslim world, and they were encouraging people to send questions to them. And the rabbis started to do the same thing. So if you were a rabbi in North Africa, in Kairouan, then or in Fez, you might send your letter back across North Africa through Egypt all the way out to Baghdad, to the area where the Jews were. They would debate it. They would send a response from the Gaon, and it would come back to your community. And along the way, people would read the responsum. They didn't necessarily keep it secret, and these became precedents. And some rabbis, famous rabbis of the medieval period, like Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Avram Adret, he wrote 3,000 or more of these responsa. And that continued, and to this day, there are many responsa being written, and many of us use a collection of them put out by Bar Ilan University. It's a little dongle that goes on your computer and gives you access to thousands of them. So David, when you asked, how do I approach it, and to what extent is my approach similar or different? Well, it's similar in that I go to the same sources that any other rabbi would. I look at the Talmud and Midrash, I look at the medieval codes, and I look at the responsa. And so that is all the same. And like modern Orthodox rabbis, not Orthodox rabbis in the modern period, people like Rabbi Moshe Feinstein of blessed memory, or Shlomo Zalman Auerbach of blessed memory, or Eliezer Waldenberg, I also would speak with experts in that field. So if it's about medicine, I'm going to speak with doctors and try to find out, what the reality is, and then try to interpret based on what I learned from them and connect it to established precedents. I'll give an example about an established precedent. On genetic engineering, I said, well, one of the concerns is transgenic organisms. When you take, let's say, something from one species of fish and put it into another species of fish. You could have a species of salmon, a kosher fish, which has some DNA put in it from an eel, which is a non-kosher fish. It's the resulting organism, a kosher animal for consumption. And so I would try to look at established rules in our tradition to find sort of a model that I could use as a basis. Some of my responsa are going back to a very specific question. A rabbi friend of mine whose son is blind asked me, can my son read Torah? And so I was actually answering a specific rabbi's question. But in the law committee, we tend to generalize the questions, make them broader, so it's not described as just about a response to one person, but more a research topic about response to a whole topic. The way that my papers are a little bit different from many Orthodox ones is that, first of all, I do a lot more introduction about the science. Some of these tshuvot have, a dozen pages before I get to my rabbinic sources, because I'm really trying to introduce what the presenting issues are. Another thing, as I said in the introduction, is that I'm more likely to cite values, sort of meta-halachic principles that are, I believe, inherent in the tradition, but are not always explicit. There was a great rabbi of the last century named Aaron Lichtenstein. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of a yeshiva in the West Bank called Yeshiva Har Etzion. And he wrote an essay once in the Journal of the Israeli Defense Forces about human dignity, kvod habriot, in which he says, human dignity is often in the background of when a posek is making a decision, but they don't like to quote it because it sounds soft. So they're always going to try to find a more formal ruling to base themselves on. But there's a cost to that decision, he said, because here you have a core theological and moral principle that humans have dignity as a result of being created in the divine image. Why would you hesitate to cite that? And so I think I'm much more likely to foreground the values without dispensing of the precedents in the halachic literature, to make sure that I'm not just sort of saying what feels right, but I'm actually connecting it to what our ancestors have shown us to be right.
Sorry, I was looking for my unmute button.
Yeah.
To follow that, you made reference to your audience, right? Your intended audience, and you observe, and I think most of us, looking at the world that we occupy would agree, that most of the people in our communities are not oriented toward halakhah as such. They may take instruction, they may be interested in values expressed through halakhah, but they're not interested in halakhic outcomes as such. And obviously, this is an enterprise which is looking to define halakhic outcomes. So you've mentioned it, but I'd like a little bit of expansion. How do you see what you're writing here as connecting to, as communicating with, as influencing Jews who don't feel themselves to be subject to the authority of halakhah?
Well, the Jewish people has a very long history of vacillating in any given lifetime, and sometimes in any given day, between um, a pious desire to do the right thing as understood by the tradition and the rabbis, and a ornery resistance to anyone telling them what to do. And you certainly see that in the Torah itself, and certainly the prophets. And it's true that today there are parts of the Jewish world which are much more ready to give obedience to whatever they're told is the law. But what I've found is that our people tend to be curious, and in some parts of their life, let's say the laws of mourning, They want to make sure they did it the right way. And sometimes also life and death decisions, end of life. Rabbi, is it okay to disconnect my relative from the ventilator? They don't want to do something that they would feel guilty about and feel that they'd be judged badly, that they had murdered their loved one. And yet when it comes to, what they're having for lunch today and whether Rabbi Nevins or Rabbi Kramer approves of what they put on their plate, they're perhaps less worried about our opinion on that. So consistency maybe is not our greatest strength, but curiosity is. The other piece is that, as you know, these books are hard to access. Halachic literature is not, for the most part, translated. It tends to be very technical language. It requires a survey of a lot of literature before you even know what they're talking about. Even if you know Hebrew, you can't just open up the Bar Ilan database and start reading without really having a lot of context. And so it's a bit off-putting. There are, of course, guidebooks that try to give access to this information. But until you really sit in this literature, it's hard to relate to it and to feel its power, its beauty, its authority. So that said, I'm sitting in my school right now, and this semester I'm teaching a high school elective for 11th and 12th graders. And, we are talking about Torah and technology. And even if these kids don't all keep kosher or Shabbat, and some of them do, some of them don't, they're all interested in what our tradition has to say about the sort of reforming of life and whether lab-grown meat is kosher or even meat altogether. And some of the big issues that have to do with, with the pandemic, for instance, the triage issues, they get the sense that these are big, important decisions being made, and they do want to know what Jewish tradition has to say. I'm assuming that the people on this call are interested in what Jewish tradition has to say, whether or not they think of themselves as a perfectly observant Jew. Who of us is a perfectly observant Jew? And just saying it is Elul, and this is a time to think about the places where we are not perfect in our practice, but not to give up hope, but to think of ourselves as works in progress, to continue to refine ourselves and come closer to our ideals. So that's the way I think of halakhah. It's not a binary yes or no. You care about halakhah or you don't, you're observant or you're not, but it's about trying to move closer towards righteousness in our lives.
Hey, great. Our friend and colleague, Rabbi Julia Andelman, just contributed a question in the chat. Ironically, I was just about to ask the same question with a slightly different nuance, but very much along the same path. You begin with a question. It's a question in life. You want to go back to the sources to see what Jewish teachings and tradition might direct us to do, how it might counsel us. I imagine sometimes that's very challenging, right? I mean, not technically challenging. You just commented on that, but challenging because we living in our world have our own values. And I imagine that everyone involved here has values that are at least in some sense independent of the inputs of Torah in the broadest sense. So I wonder, and Julia expressed the same, which of the tshuvas that you include in your book, or I guess you could use an example outside, but which did you find the most challenging to pursue? And I would add to that, are there occasions where you came to a conclusion based upon your reading of the sources that was contrary to your own inclination or values? Are there tshuvas, in other words, where the bottom line was one that you regretted?
Well, one example was the brain death tshuva. I remember reading a New Yorker article called "Good is Dead," and what it was the author's name was Greenberg. I don't remember his first name, but he was very skeptical about how quickly America had shifted to accepting brain death. I mentioned it earlier. There was an ad hoc committee at Harvard Medical School in the late 60s, I think it was 68 or so, when cyclosporine had been developed, that was sort of an anti-rejection drug. And now all of a sudden, there was the possibility of putting vital organs to transplant and save lives. The problem was, where do you get them? Where do you find those organs? And so conveniently, this committee came up with an alternative definition of death and said, well, if there's no brainstem activity, then you're considered dead, and we can take your organs. And we're not killing you. We're just continuing the process of dying or something. And he was witheringly critical of this and said, you're basically killing people. And that was actually the opinion that some in the Orthodox world had as well. J. David Bleich, most famously in the modern Orthodox world here, that the heart is the very definition of life and heartbeat. And how could you possibly take a beating heart out of somebody and then stick them in the grave without being a murderer? And so I think I came to that project with a lot of skepticism of my own. Of course, I was torn because I also want to save lives, don't we all? But I thought one of our classic statements in Judaism is "Ein dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh." You don't kill one person to save another person's life. And so, if you're going to tell me this is murder, then I'm sorry, you can't do that. And so you have to wait till the person dies fully, and if their organs atrophy and are no longer viable for transplant, so be it. But over the course of my research, I came to think that it was actually not heartbeats. Man, sneeze here. One second. I'm so glad I was able to mute and spare you all that.
There you go. We're at the worst of the fall allergy season here in the Northeast.
I came around to thinking of respiration as the core criterion for life and death, and that when the brainstem fails, there's no longer the capacity of spontaneous respiration, after which heartbeat fails as well. And so it seemed to me that actually it was reasonable to declare death. So that was an example of a place where I switched positions. A more recent one had to do with triage in the pandemic. I remember, actually, I was at JTS. It was Erev Purim, and it was March of 2020, and I was one of the first people to get COVID, Mazel Tov. And
I remember it well.
Yeah. And we put Purim on Zoom that night, as I recall, and our colleague Jan Orbeck and I watched Megillah for the first time in my life on Zoom. And everybody started thinking, can you make a minyan on Zoom? And I have a paper about that, a chapter about that in the book. But I have a friend who's a physician in Boston, and he says, with due respect, Danny, there are more important things in the world than can you make a minyan on Zoom. Right now in my hospital in Boston, we are making decisions about who's getting, personal protective equipment. There aren't enough masks to go around. There aren't enough ventilators to go around. There aren't enough ICU rooms to go around. There isn't enough staff to go around. And eventually, once they had vaccines, there's not enough vaccine to go around. Who gets it? Do you give it first to the emergency personnel on the theory that helping them avoid getting sick will allow you to save many more lives? What about if someone already is sick and you can only save one life? Whose life do you save? And this quickly took us into utilitarian territory, which is something I mentioned briefly before. Not only how many lives can you save? If you can save 5 lives at the cost of 1, should you do that? But sometimes they were talking about how many years of life could you save. If you had 2 patients, one 35, one 55, and they both were seriously ill and in need of ventilation, and both have the capacity to survive and to live years, maybe decades, hopefully decades of life, should you give priority to the 35-year-old who's more likely to live a little bit longer than the 55-year-old? Or do you say that, no, you can't take such considerations into stock? And that was something where I really struggled. And I had some debate with my friend and colleague, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who I felt was going a little bit too much in that utilitarian direction. And I argued back that we really need to always be thinking about the patients in front of us and give priority to whoever we can save, and not think about how many years of life we could save.
I see you looking down at your screen. There's this comment by Howard Kaufman. He says that he was involved. Maybe you want to take a look at that and see if you want to respond or ask a question.
Yeah. Tenler. So Howard, I'm just reading it quickly. I'm glad that you worked on that committee, and congratulations on being able to save so many lives. They sometimes say that from one donor, you could save 7 lives theoretically, and pediatrics is especially challenging because adult organs don't fit in children's bodies. Moshe Tendler was if I get it right, the son-in-law of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. He was the one who actually pushed back at J. David Bleich, and you had this sort of extensive debate between these two branches of this sort of that part of the world, and debating whether brain death could be allowed or not. And as I recall, Moshe Feinstein was being lobbied by both sides, and he made numerous statements which seemed to show motion. That's one of the questions about rabbis answering questions is how much lobbying are they receiving, and how much do they resist pressure or accept that pressure is valid and needs to be heard. And so Moshe Tendler took the position that this is early in the debate, this is in the 1980s, that a flat brainwave, they would use EEGs, was sufficient to prove that there was no brain activity, and that therefore you could accept that this person has died and you could transplant vital organs. And as I recall, the Tendler position was influential not only in America, but also in Israel, where the chief rabbinate accepted that. My paper actually updated that because it was 20 years later now, and the diagnostic criteria that were being used in the 1980s were no longer considered to be definitive. And now the desire was to have what was called the apnea test. So I started reading some of the medical journals, Neurology and New England Journal and things like that, and speaking with both pulmonologists and neurologists to try to understand what was the state of art in declaring death by neurological criteria. And it really came down to something called the apnea test, where after all the other tests had been done, and they had ruled out what they called confounding factors. This person wasn't under barbiturates or alcohol. They weren't suffering hypothemia or hyperthemia. Once all those other things had been considered, they would hyperoxygenate them, turn the ventilator to 100% oxygen, draw blood gas, turn off the ventilator, and wait some time, I think about 10 minutes, draw blood again, and then restart the ventilator. And they would see, had the person been able to have spontaneous respiration? If yes, then they would maintain their blood gases. But if not, then the carbon dioxide would go way up, the oxygen would go down. You could say they can't breathe. And to my mind, it wasn't enough to say yes or no to brain death. You had to actually have a diagnostic criterion like that, which is what I wrote about in the 2004 paper, which you can read in chapter, I think it's 8 or 9 of this book. Oh, you say 16 lives saved from one donation. That's great. I will say that we had a conference at JTS about 6 or 7 years ago with a neurologist who's skeptical about brain death named Alan Schumann. And he has said that even that apnea test that I just described is not always adequate. There are some people with an upper spinal cord damage that could have brain function, but not be able to have any physical responses. And so it would mimic it. And so he was very skeptical. And so we had this conference, and Len Scharzrus, a JTS identified physician and rabbi, and I both argued that there were ways of accommodating those concerns. So the thing about Torah and Technology is it's constantly a moving target. The technology keeps changing, and our understanding, we have to keep going back. And what I say several places in this book is that I'm offering these not as definitive final answers, that yes or no, but more as models of engagement, of how do you connect the contemporary questions with the emerging technology.
Right. Danny, I imagine that in listening to what you just said now, and the very complicated questions of technology, of science, and new understandings that develop within the context of such considerations, I imagine there are people who might say, well, the world is radically different today than it was when the Torah was formulated or when Torah was formulated. Needless to say, if we're, 3,000 years since, some form of Torah, depending upon the biblical history you do, let it be 3,000 or 2,500 years since Torah in the rabbinic sense was formulated, right? So somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 years. Are there places where Torah just simply doesn't provide us with an answer because it couldn't have anticipated the world in which we live and the questions we're forced to ask?
So this is again why I connect to what I call purposive interpretation, because you're trying to find values in our tradition which remain relevant, even if the technology is not something that could be anticipated. Now, as you know, one of my papers, actually the first chapter in this book, is about artificial intelligence and autonomous machines. So did the rabbis anticipate self-driving vehicles or autonomous weapon systems? Perhaps not. But they did actually have ideas of, well, what is the connection of my responsibility to property that I have, such as animals, that act independently of me and that cause damage? To what extent am I responsible for training the animal, restraining the animal, repairing the damage done by the animal, even though it was sort of acting independently of me? And so it's sort of a model that I would look at and say, well, the rabbis believe that there is a difference between an action I take directly and an indirect action. But just the fact that a machine did something on my behalf doesn't exonerate me entirely from all responsibility for the damage. That's an example that I would give. There's also some crazy stuff in the Talmud, as you know, and very fantastical stuff. There's a story about Rava Bara Gavra, that Rava created a man and sent it to visit his friend Rabbi Zera, and which is sort of the source of the idea of the golem. And even though the golem, is the matter of rabbinic legend, it becomes much more prominent in the Middle Ages. It raised some interesting questions, like, well, if we did create a life form that could speak and could interact and could move and could take actions in the world, to what extent might we consider that android to have human rights? In that story in the Talmud, Rabbi Zera sniffs out that this is a false approximation of life. It's not a real person, and he says, "Shuv la'afarech," go back to your dirt, and basically kills the thing. Was he a murderer? And I think that's quite relevant because even this week I've been listening to podcasts that have to do with using AIs to stand in for us, and to what extent is that an ethical thing to do, to rely on these ersatz humans to make human decisions. Also, we've got major decisions, life and death decisions are being made. There's a book I quote called An Army of None by Robert Sher, which is really about new developments in military, both the United States and Russia, Ukraine, China, and certainly Israel are all using artificial intelligence to generate target lists, for instance, for bombing runs, to respond to intruders, and life and death decisions are being made. So I found that the rabbis did give us examples of how you might approach these types of decisions. Stories like Rabbi Akiva, the famous story with the two men in the wilderness with just one can of water, and stories of Rabba, again, talking about, can you kill somebody whose existence is threatening to you, even though they themselves are not threatening you. And so I think you can look at these stories as a source of values. I will give one little asterisk to it. I remember that in the 1970s and 80s, when there was a lot of talk about, turning off ventilators and such, that rabbis were quoting stories from the Middle Ages about, can you ask the wood chopper to stop chopping the wood, or the story of Rabbi Yehuda's death and his maid throwing the ceramic pot off the roof to make people stop praying, and these were used as proof that there's a time to allow a person to die, maybe that you could even do something active to hasten their death. And I think a lot of us came to realize that, yes, those stories are good for showing us some value illustrations, that comes a time to shift your priority from healing to comfort care. But we shouldn't be reading them in a mechanical or mechanistic way to say, because that story is told, therefore you can turn off the ventilator. It's more about gaining values from this tradition and then using your best wisdom today to try to explain those values and how they play out in our context.
And are you working on a tshuva now? What's the next one, and when can we expect to read it?
Well, yes, but okay, so in the book, in the introduction, I say that the largest topic of technology, I don't deal with at all, which is, of course, the climate crisis. And I'm very interested in issues having to do with geoengineering. What things can we do to sort of alter the climate of the world directly, whether it's diffusing sunlight from reaching Earth to try to cool things down a bit, sequestering carbon dioxide and methane that's already in the atmosphere, try to cool things down, using reflective paints, all these things that are being proposed. And all of them having dangers that are associated with them, and questions of whose responsibility is it, who pays for it. First world societies like the United States created most of these problems, and we are also creating solutions to the problems, and we will then own those technologies and profit the most from those problems. So what about the many peoples of the world in the global south, for instance, who did not burn all that fuel, did not become wealthy, powerful nations, and will be left behind by these technologies too? So there's ethical issues, and there's so that's something that's the next project. I am currently actually working on a different project, which is not about technology. It's about people with multi-faith identities. And so for the law committee right now, I'm working with our colleague, Katya Vilo, who she's a chaplain at Fordham right now, working with people from many different faith backgrounds, as most of our colleagues on college campuses are. And it's not a question about intermarriage or anything like that per se. It's more about how do we work with people who have complex religious histories and for whom Judaism is an important component of their identity, their family history, but not an exclusive component. Again, we rabbis always want a binary. Yes, they are a halachic Jew, or no, they're not a halachic Jew. But the reality is much more muddy than that. And what are our pastoral strategies, our educational strategies, and also our ritual strategies to help these people feel that their journey is valued by us, whether or not we consider them to be halachic Jews. So that's a project I'm working on, which is complicated. Brian, yes, you have the time wrong on your calendar. It's 1 to 2. Jack Schlachter asked, Rabbi Schlachter, if technology shows fairly conclusively that there is extraterrestrial life, what would there be halakhic implications? So
Depends whether we want to marry them, I guess, right?
yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I was just listening to Science Friday, one of my favorite shows with our Flato, and did I get that right? No, I think so. Yeah, and look, there are billions and billions of planets in the universe, and likely that there is life out there, but it's not necessarily life that we would recognize. It's not life that would be similar to our lives. Maybe there is life that's similar to ours. If it is, then I suppose you could ask these questions of, does it have the same image of God status that that we consider humans to have today? I guess that would be a halachic question. But I'm much more focused on the real ones that we're dealing with today, such as if you use a vocal clone, AI to create a clone, and you connect it to a chatbot like GPT-4o, and you have it interacting in real time with minimum latency so that it can actually have a conversation like we're having today. At some point, you start to say that this is actually comparable to humans. Believed that the core component of the distinguishing factor of human life is de'ah v'dibur, sort of intelligence and the ability to speak. And as we have manufactured life forms that have those abilities to speak, even if it's just predictive based on, large language models, at some point they're creating new content. And it does raise philosophical questions about what is intelligence. If there's a general artificial intelligence, will we start to feel that it has some rights? And I will say already, many of us are using this type of modeling to generate words of Torah. So if this Shabbat, when I'm scheduled to give the Devar Torah, I didn't use ChatGPT, but let's say I did, would that be a Devar Torah if it was generated not by a human who read the Torah, but by a machine? There is something sacred about saying words of Torah. Is it less sanctified when it's not generated by a person? Those are some of the questions that I'm having there.
Well, we would certainly be able to tell the difference between artificially generated Devar Torah and yours.
Can I just say one cool thing?
Sure, go ahead.
Last week, because I'm teaching this class, I put a prompt in ChatGPT. What are the halachic implications of artificial intelligence? And within like 5 seconds, it spat out, 6 really well-formulated paragraphs on 6 different topics. It was astonishing. I went into the Bing one and I asked the same question, and it gave me a very familiar looking answer. And it even had a reference. And it turned out it was referencing me. So I was like, so I took
great.
that as
That's great.
I've arrived, when I'm being
There you
cited by
go. There
machines.
you go. So before we end, I just want to, you mentioned at the beginning that there is a new volume being published by Izun Books for this high holidays that you wanted to just bring, call people's attention to. So why don't you do that?
So thank you. Izun Books is the publisher that I used. They're fairly new, although they've been around a few years now and have been publishing a lot. And so this book is called Nothing So Whole as a Broken Heart. And what it is it's a collection of essays about the world as we enter 5785, relating really to the trauma of the past year. And it's organized around Elul, Rosh Hashanah, the 10 days, and Yom Kippur. I contributed an essay about one of the Pew team. And so I haven't actually seen the whole book yet, so I'm waiting for my copy to arrive. If you look here, you can also see that there's that there are other books, and I think my book would be under Jewish thought, Torah and Technology. There it is. And so if you want to order the book, you can get it through Izun, and you can also get it through Amazon. If you do it through Amazon, it's actually a slightly different printing than the Izun one. It's just the way that books are being made these days with print on demand. But I'd love to hear your thoughts if you do get a chance to read either book.
Great. Well, thank you for what a rich and interesting discussion. Very appreciative. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that. Thank you all for coming. You are on our list, so you will get notices of upcoming book talks and other programs from JTS and its library. Later on in the month, we have a conversation with recent Chancellor Arnie Eisen relating to his new book on theology. So I'm looking forward to that. Invite you to come back for that occasion. In the meantime, again, thank you, and I wish you all a Shana Yoter Tova, a better year this coming one, God willing. Thanks a lot, and Danny, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Bye, everyone.